Hello and welcome back to the DRH show. Today we are thrilled to have someone within psychology and mental health research. She's not just a researcher with lived experience, she's also a passionate advocate for women's mental health. Retraining in psychology later in life, she undertook a doctorate part-time at King's College London in 2010 due to her concern about the lack of preconception advice and research for women with bipolar disorder. She's currently PPI Lead for the Effectiveness and Cost Effectiveness of Community Perinatal Mental Health Services Project. Dr. Clare Dolman, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Dennis.
Okay, so Dr. Dolman, just to kick this off, could you just share to us more about your background, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing?
Sure. Well, I'm a journalist by profession originally, but I have bipolar disorder myself, bipolar 1, and got my diagnosis when I was 23 years old. So later in life, in my 40s, I decided to go back to university and work in psychology. So I did that, and I did a PhD about women with bipolar disorder making decisions about pregnancy and childbirth, because from working with the charities here in the UK, I discovered that there was a real need in that area.
Just before we delve further into bipolar disorder, if you could just step back a bit. So for the benefit of those who's watching, could you just explain to us in a nutshell what bipolar disorder is? And could you also give us some statistics or some information about how it's currently diagnosed?
Yeah, sure. Well, bipolar is a disorder of extreme mood. So it involves either being extremely high. That it's probably easier to say there are two main types, bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, which are slightly different. And if you have bipolar 1, which I have, it means you experience mania, which is sort of the most extreme type of high mood, which involves you being very impulsive and reckless, and your thoughts race at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and it's quite difficult when you're extremely manic to function properly. And that's often when you get hospitalized because you behave in a very out of character way. But as well as having that extreme mania, you also can have episodes of hypomania, so also high mood but less extreme than that, which are actually often very productive. You don't need so much sleep. You get a lot done. Your mind is working very well, but not crazily fast. And you also have big periods of depression, and these are often with a lot of people. They're in cycles. Like if you have an extreme high, certainly in my situation, if I had a very high mood, I would usually then crash and have a period of a very low mood. And bipolar 2 is similar, but you don't, instead of having those great big highs and lows, you don't have the mania, you only have the hypermania as well as the depression. Sometimes it seems to be regarded as a less severe form of the disorder, but in reality it isn't really. It's just the fact that it's more depressive episodes are the more significant episodes usually for people with bipolar 2. But it is a whole spectrum. Sorry, it is a spectrum. There are sort of other variations on the spectrum, but those are the two main categories.
Yeah, yes, and as you've highlighted, it's very complex and it overlaps with a range of mental health issues. But thank you for giving us a snapshot of what bipolar disorder is. And I suppose what I want to hear from you, Dr. Dolman, is can you give us an idea how many people live with and are affected by bipolar disorder? Because you're doing research about these areas.
Sure. I mean, globally, it's pretty accepted that it's about 2% of the population, and that doesn't sort of vary across cultures or different nations. Apart from it, you would probably get quite a few papers with a higher number than that in the US, maybe because they tend to talk more about the whole spectrum rather than just the sort of stricter categories of 1 and 2. So you sometimes in the US they describe it as being more like 4 or 5%, but certainly in Europe we tend to look at it as about 2%. So in the UK, that we're thinking about 1.3 million people. It's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people. Now, let's talk about your research, Dr. Dolman. I recently published an article on PsycRich about your research where you said there's a link between bipolar disorder and hypersexual behavior. So, of course, you have lived experience of bipolar disorder, but how did you kind of approach this research? Because it's quite an interesting link.
Yeah. Well, it's something that I was always interested in because, as you may know, there is a great delay to diagnosis in bipolar disorder. We recently had a bipolar commission here in the UK through the charity Bipolar UK, and our findings were that that delay in diagnosis is still 9.5 years. In the last sort of 30 years, it's been around 10 years. So, it virtually hasn't changed at all. And that's very disappointing, obviously, because that period when people are suffering from the condition, but they do not have a diagnosis and therefore they're not getting any help, either medication or psychological help or support generally from their friends and family, because nobody realizes what it is that they have. And that period of time is usually in your late teens to late 20s, because that's the biggest time when people this seems to come out in people and they get a diagnosis. So if you think about that period of your life, you're going, you're leaving school, you're leaving home, you're going to university, you're getting a new job, you're having your first flat, your first relationships, whatever, then obviously it's a time of great stress and also a time where you're trying out lots of things. So if you behave in a out of character way at that time, you and perhaps those around you wouldn't necessarily, notice it as much and see it as something that was pathological, because they'd think, oh, it's an 18-year-old, or they're sort of behaving in this strange way. So, I mean, I suffered with hypersexuality when I was in my late teens and early 20s, because I didn't get a diagnosis till I was 23. And it was very, in retrospect, I definitely put myself in situations that were dangerous and behaved in ways that were very out of character for me. I raised a Catholic, I went to a convent. I wouldn't normally behave in a sort of hypersexual way. And so it was very strange for me when I came down from the high, because the whole thing is that it's not like all people with bipolar are always going around behaving in this hypersexual way. That is completely wrong. The fact is, it is a symptom of being either manic or hypomanic. And it is an actual, it is a recognized symptom. So it only happens if you are hypomanic or manic. And then when you come down from that high and you're usually depressed and you're looking back on it and thinking, how could I behave like that? Why did I do that? And it's very, very difficult psychologically to come to terms with how you behave like that if it's very out of character for you. So I think I was always interested in it, but I wasn't aware of there being very much about it. So when I was involved with this bipolar commission for the charity Bipolar UK, and I was asked to cover the section on things that particularly affected women with bipolar, because that's my area. I did a survey asking women about issues affecting them, like menopause and periods and childbirth and everything, obviously, and how these interacted with their bipolar disorder, which is a lot. And I thought, well, I'll put a question in there about hypersexuality just to see what the reaction is. And the reaction was massive. And I was sort of quite overwhelmed by it, really, because so many women said, yes, this definitely was something that they had struggled with. And I had an open text box, and I got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people writing to me, sharing with me their experiences of having a really terrible time as a result of it, and that they had got no help for it. Some people said they'd never told anybody about, their experiences about it. And it was quite upsetting, actually, to read all that. And so I talked to the charity about it, and they asked me to do another survey involving men as well, about hypersexuality and how it affected people, and sort of in more detail. So we did that one, and that one was more startling in a way, because 88% of the people who responded, and we had over 1,600 people respond, and 88% of them said that they had experienced this symptom of hypersexual behavior. So obviously, it affects the majority of people. Well, I say obviously, it's a survey, so it's not, but it gives an indication that it affects a lot of people. And the most shocking thing about it for me was the amount of pain and real trauma that came as a result of it, because a third of people said that they had been sexually assaulted, 34%. But for women, that figure was 42% and 17% for men. And 22% said they'd been raped during one of these periods of hypersexuality. And of course, that was significantly more for women than men. 28% of women said they'd been raped, as opposed to 9% of men. So, and they also, wrote a lot of free text about their experiences, anonymously. But it was really quite, hard to read a lot of it, because they'd obviously had an awful lot of trauma about it, and because it was involved with their illness, they couldn't, and the shame of it all, they couldn't talk to anybody about it, so they didn't get any help with it. And also, when they with clinicians, once they had a diagnosis and things, with clinicians really don't talk about it very much either, whether it's because it's an uncomfortable thing to talk about. I mean, you'd expect psychiatrists to be able to talk about this sort of thing, but they don't get specific training in it. And certainly in my survey, 60% of those people asked said that no clinician had asked them about this subject. And it's the sort of thing, a little bit like domestic violence, that you're not going to volunteer it very quickly, because it's a thing that you feel ashamed about, and it's very difficult to talk about. And so I think it's really important for the whole community to know about the issue, and that just how serious it is. It's not something to be taken lightly, or as if it's some sort of titillating aspect of it, that you're hypersexual. That's a very unfortunate, response, because for example, 60% of my sample said that they felt self-disgust looking back at how they behaved. And so you can imagine that, psychologically, that's very bad for you. So 60% are psychologically damaged, and then all those people who've been assaulted or raped, have also suffering really serious trauma, and probably complex PTSD, which is really complicating their bipolar disorder and making it much more difficult for them to recover.
And Dr. Dolman, that scale of prevalence, you mentioned about the 8 to 8% who have experienced hypersexual behavior. Was it surprising for you? Because you sort of like already have a working hypothesis earlier that it could be linked to, manic symptoms. So I was just wondering, were you surprised by it, or were already earlier research about this potential link between the two?
No, Dennis, I think the thing is that I was shocked when I first started looking at the literature on this, because there's so little literature on it. There's a separate literature on hypersexuality per se as a sort of condition on its own, but there really isn't very much literature on hypersexuality as a really important part of bipolar. And I was really shocked. For example, it's only last year there was one tiny qualitative paper. I think it was 5 people were interviewed for qualitative paper. That's the only qualitative paper in all the literature about the experience of hypersexuality, and I found that very, very shocking. And the bits of literature there are, which is partly why I'm talking to you, because I've been involved in a comment piece that came out in the Lancet Psychiatry just for June edition, and I reviewed some of the literature in that, but it's very, very sparse, and it sort of agreed with the response that I got with the women's survey, in that it's about 60-65% of people with bipolar sort of say that they suffer this symptom. Obviously, the 88% from my survey is because we advertised the second survey specifically about hypersexuality. So obviously, you're going to get a much higher percentage of people who, say, oh yes, I had that, and so they do the survey. So it's not very indicative, but sort of 65% is still a very high number, I think.
It is definitely a high number. So aside from hypersexuality as sort of like a component of component of bipolar disorder, do you have any other findings from your research?
Yes, I mean, you mean about the hypersexuality research or other?
Yeah.
Yes. I think really the most important thing to me was the questions that were asked about the effect in people's lives, how much impact this had on them. And this is where I think it's so important for researchers and clinicians and everyone really to understand the seriousness of this, and that it's not something titillating or to be treated as a sort of amusing aspect of bipolar, because it's in no way amusing. For example, 2/3 of the people in my survey said that they had suicidal thoughts, actually as a result of hypersexuality. And 20% said that they had attempted suicide because of it. So, I mean, I think that's, that shows you just how serious it is. I mean, I'm just thinking of over 37% self-harmed, and said that it had impacted more than half of serious relationships. 14% had lost their jobs. I'm just looking at some of these figures in here. 40% suffered money problems. 13% left their studies. 20% reported they had had an unplanned pregnancy. And a quarter of them had contracted an STI. So it has really big impacts in people's lives, and also talking about their experience of it, looking back. I mentioned that 60% said that they felt self-disgust and ashamed, and 55% felt guilty because they felt bad that they had treated, their partners and their friends and other people badly when they behaved like that. And even I think 20 odd percent said that they would never come to terms with their behaviour because they felt so bad about it, and that they really dreaded their mood changing again, not having control over that, because they really didn't want to have to behave like that again. So I just think it's so important to realise that, and to take on board that it's a very harmful aspect of bipolar, because I was quite shocked when I looked at the DSM, you know, and the psychiatrist Bible, as they call it, because in that it's sort of hardly mentioned in the symptoms, but it's something like it comes under the section about impulsive behaviour and risk taking, and it just says it means that sufferers are more likely to commit, quote, sexual indiscretions, which I think is the most awful term and very trivializing of what is a very serious subject. And so I really, in the Lancet piece, we call for that to be changed, because I don't think that, you know, trainee psychiatrists, psychologists looking up about bipolar and this particular symptom should be told that it's sexual indiscretions. You know, all these over 40% of women's reporting rape, that is not a sexual indiscretion. So I thought that was very poor, actually, and I think it definitely needs to be changed, and that's something that I'm trying to campaign on.
Absolutely. And talking about change, do you think that recognizing hypersexuality as a symptom of bipolar disorder, because earlier you were talking about delay in diagnosis, do you think this could help in, you know, that diagnosing bipolar disorder?
Yeah, for sure,
Mm.
because I mean, I think it is such a distinctive characteristic, and I
Mm.
think if you in your teenage years, if you start behaving in this way that is not typical of you, you know, like I was saying, perhaps you might think, oh, I'll be more sort of, I don't know, adventurous and whatnot, you know, and go out more and try and be more social and meet more sexual partners or whatever when I'm at university and I've got more freedom and things like that. That isn't unusual, but if it gets extreme, you know, so you're behaving in a bad way and you've sort of got several partners at once, or things are getting out of hand and you're upsetting lots of people that you know, and but you don't really understand why you're behaving like that. And if you've heard something about this, you know, it might, or somebody else close to you has heard about it and thought that she doesn't really behave like that usually. What is the matter with her? You know, it might ring bells that could this be possibly, you know, especially if it's linked with any other clues, like one of her parents or grandparents or relatives has bipolar, you know, other things that might mean that she was more likely to have a diagnosis. So I think it definitely could help. And so I think you yourself might recognize it as then think, oh, well, I'll look up on the websites and things and see whether this could be bipolar. Or if you go to the doctor, you know, if we manage to raise awareness about it as a serious symptom that needs to be taken seriously, perhaps more GPs and psychiatrists will, you know, ask about it and will be sensitive about discussing it, and that would be a real step forward, I think, for sure.
I wasn't sure if but perhaps you mentioned it earlier, but I apologize if you already mentioned it earlier. But I wasn't sure if your participants in your study were females, because I was just interested whether you've identified any gender differences in hypersexuality.
Yeah. Well, sorry, perhaps I wasn't very clear. I did a survey initially, which was sort of called Women and Bipolar,
Mm-hmm.
which was obviously only women, which just had one question in it about hypersexuality, and that's the one that came up with the sort of 63-65% figure of experience. And then following that, we did one that was across genders, and we had more women than men respond. I think it was about 58-60% were women who responded, but we had quite a good spread. And it was interesting because there wasn't really a gender difference in a lot of things, in terms of whether they had experienced it, whether they were more sexually active than usual when they were experiencing it, which 80-odd% said they were. Things like, not using contraception when they normally would have done. About 40-odd% said that they'd done that, which they would have been much more responsible. And over 50% said that they put themselves in potentially dangerous situations. That was a bit higher for women, of course, because I think, if you're in those sort of situations where you're going to clubs and meeting strangers for sex, then obviously that's usually going to be a more dangerous situation for a woman than for a man. So that probably is a reflection of that. But there were a few other differences. I'm just trying to remember. I think we also asked about like use of pornography. For some people, that was a real problem when they had these periods of behavior, and that I expected that to be more a male problem, but actually it was quite similar. Using paying people for sex was higher among males. I think that was significant. Yeah, so that was the sort of breakdown, more or less. That it's not hugely gendered, but obviously, apart from in the case of being assaulted or raped, that was the most significant difference between the sexes.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dr. Dolman, in terms of advice, what would you say to someone experiencing hypersexual behavior, or for anyone who's got a loved one experiencing these things?
Yeah. Well, I think it's slightly different in terms of if you're experiencing this and you don't, and you're pre-diagnosis, so you don't know you've got a diagnosis, you don't know what's happening to you. And just to say, it's not just a purely bipolar thing. I mean, I understand ADHD, people with ADHD also, this is a symptom for many of them. So, it doesn't mean if you're behaving out of character in this way, you must have bipolar. That's not the case. But I think if you are behaving in that way and you don't understand what's going on, then perhaps it would be worth investigating whether perhaps you might have bipolar or you might have ADHD, by sort of hopefully going to see a clinician about it, and investigating what you can online. I mean, there are good sites out there to sort of try and say, oh, these are the symptoms. Do I have the symptoms? For example, when I was diagnosed, I was dragged off into hospital, manic. So, and then after about, I don't know how many, 5, 6 weeks or something, because I was given lithium, and I'm a very good lithium responder. So if I take my lithium, I'm absolutely well. So I'm very, very lucky. But when I started to get better, before I left the hospital, they told me, oh, you have bipolar. And I was, absolutely shocked and everything. But I think if you have bipolar 2, which is even more difficult to diagnose because it's so confused with depression, because unless you have a severe mania, then most people will only go to the doctors when they are depressed, because the hypomania is doesn't usually cause you problems so much. It can be productive. But if you have these symptoms and these symptoms cause you problems, then it would be great if you were able to go to your clinician and say, I understand this is a symptom of this or this, and I think that I have this, and to try and find out about that so that you can get the help that you need before that condition escalates and becomes worse and causes you more problems, because of course, because of it happening in this window of sort of late teens, early 20s, what happens is with people not getting diagnosis is that they very often drop out of their course at university. They lose their job, they break up, ruin their new marriage or whatever because of how they behave, and they don't get any help until it's too late, and those things have then blighted your life. So it's very important to try and recognize these things in yourself or in a friend. But if you're post-diagnosis and you still suffer with this, because unfortunately, I would say the majority of people with bipolar, are not 100% well, certainly with medication and self-management, because the medication, it doesn't work well enough. We don't have enough research, and it doesn't work well enough for most people. So most people still have, it might lessen the number of episodes or this degree of severity of their episodes, but it's often people who take their medication and manage their condition themselves. They still, now and then, in certain circumstances when they're triggered by something or stress or whatever, will have episodes again. And so in those situations, they need to be prepared. They need to arm themselves with knowledge about this, especially if it has happened to them before, and how to sort of self-manage themselves. That's how we term it in the charity Bipolar UK, or psychoeducation it's called in lots of parts of the world. And so it's about watching your sleep, keeping regular hours. If you're beginning to feel a bit high, think, ways of recognizing it, having people check in on you, doing a mood scale, keeping an eye on what your mood is. And then perhaps if you're going a bit high, thinking, well, I'm not going to go to that party because I don't want to take the risk. I'm not going to go out drinking. I'm not going to do X, Y, Z. I'm not going to work all night on this project and exhaust myself because I'm at a time of risk and I need my sleep and I need to keep everything very regular and give myself the best chance of not having a bad episode. So that's what I think I would advise. I mean, if you're a partner, say, of somebody who is exhibiting this behavior and it's very upsetting for you, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to say be understanding. I'm sure partners are very understanding, but try and arm yourself with that knowledge as well. If you can do some research yourself and hear from other people how they've behaved and how badly they feel afterwards when they behave like this, perhaps that can make you a bit more empathetic about it, because that person is behaving like that now, but they will come back to being the person that you knew before when this episode has passed, and they need your support. And it's really helpful if you can understand it as a symptom of a medical condition. It's not, them doing whatever they want to do, being selfish, whatever, which is how it appears.
Absolutely. Well, yes, as you've emphasized, it's really important that we're aware of it, that we're well equipped when it comes to, knowledge about bipolar disorder. And this is really a serious and important discussion. And thank you for sharing your research and also your own lived experience. But also, I'm going to put the link about your research and also that opinion piece in the Lancet. But I'd like to wrap this up, this conversation, and Dr. Dolman, with some light-hearted, quick-fire questions.
Okay.
So I prepared 3 questions for you, so just we could get to know more of you as a person rather than as a researcher. Right. So first one is, what were you afraid of as a child?
Mm. I was going to say, my first thing that came in mind was falling off my bike. I love cycling.
Yeah. And what is your favorite word in another language?
In another language. Gracias.
Yes, of course, as everybody knows, it's
Yes, everybody knows that.
thank you. I suppose being gratitude, having gratitude rather.
Yeah.
And if you hadn't been a researcher, what would you have pursued in your life? Would you have stuck to being a journalist, or it would have been something
I
else?
suppose so. I suppose I would have stuck to being a journalist. Yeah, kind of. But both careers, I really like. They're very rewarding.
Mhm. And finally, the floor is all yours. What should people take away from today's conversation? You've emphasized the importance of knowledge and awareness, but is there anything else that we might have missed? And also, you could use this as an opportunity to, tell people about your research, any upcoming project.
Well, perhaps. I mean, I did say, the big takeaway for me is to the hypersexuality is a serious symptom of bipolar, and it's not to be trivialized, and that we need more research on it, and that will then provide an evidence base that there can be some better training for clinicians so that they know how to help people better with it. But if I can just sort of add on to that, just a plug for another area of research that I'm involved in, which is perinatal mental health. And we've recently created a charity, a global charity, which is it's called GAM, the Global Association of Maternal Mental Health Alliances. No, the Global Alliance of Maternal Mental Health. Oh dear, I'm terrible. I can't even get the title right. Which we're trying to join people together, across the world to improve perinatal mental health services, because they have been very, very neglected. And we had a big drive over the last 10 years here in the UK to improve perinatal mental health services here, and it was it has been and is being very, very successful. And we now have everybody has access to mother and baby units, and so it's much better for women with mental health conditions who need help around the time of childbirth. But we are very, very aware that other parts of the world is a very neglected area, both of research and in terms of provision of services. So we're really trying to do that. So if anybody is interested in this, we have and want to join with us, we have a website, which is GAMMH.org. Yes, I hope that's it. And Global Alliance for Maternal Mental Health. That's it. And it would be great if we could generate a little bit more interest for that subject. You can have me on again, Dennis, to talk about it.
That definitely. So I'll put the link to GAM also in the description also for any one of you who's got a shared interest about maternal mental health.
And could you put the Bipolar UK link in as well? Because there's a couple of webinars on there about this subject which people might be interested in.
Definitely. Now, Dr. Clare Dolman, as we continue to address the complexities of mental health, your expertise and perspectives are incredibly vital. It's been a privilege having you here at the DRH show, and I look forward to hearing more about your work.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for having me, Dennis. Cheers.